Well, this morning I want to begin our conversation by pointing your attention to this drawing of two tables that's on this whiteboard in front of you, and I'm going to begin by pointing out the obvious. I'm sure you can immediately recognize that these two tables are exactly the same size. Right? They're the same size, right? Do these tables look like they're the same size to you? They look different, don't they? I'm going to show you right now that they are, in fact, the exact same size. This is not a magic trick. This is not a sleight of hand. I'm not that good. But I'm going to show you that in spite of what your eyes are telling you right now, these two tables are, in fact, the same size. I'm going to use this template here, this cover, and I'm going to cover this table up. Right? Now notice, I'm not switching it out. I'm not reaching it behind here. Okay, look. Okay? Covers this one. And covers that one. Okay? Now, well, I know, right? I know, it's impressive, isn't it? Okay, we'll do it one more time. Do they look the same? It works both ways. Right? Okay. Okay, so now you know, without a shadow of a doubt, that the fact is that these two tables are the exact same size. Now, with that knowledge, let me ask you this. Do they look the same size now? No. It doesn't matter what the facts are. It doesn't matter what you know about these two tables. There is nothing you can do to make your brain see them as the same size. It's biology. You cannot overcome this. So don't feel bad. Your brain was built this way. More on that here in just a moment. Now what I want you to do is throughout the sanctuary, these pieces of paper, you may need to pass them around. But I want everybody to grab hold of one of these pieces of paper. They look like this. If there's a couple, there's one right in front of you if you run out. Everybody's got one? Okay, this is what you're going to do. Now, I'm going to give you the instructions first. I love everybody's like, I don't need instructions. I don't know what to do. Let me give you some instructions. Okay, so hold it out just like this with the green square on the left, with the cross in the square on the left, the yellow on your right with the dot there. And what I want you to do is to take your cover up your left eye, right? And as you hold the paper in front of you, focus with your right eye on the cross on the left. Keep focusing on the cross on the left. And as you draw it towards your face slowly, at some point around here, the circle on your right is going to disappear. Okay? If it doesn't work on your right eye, sometimes there's dominant eye issues. You may need to switch. Cover up your left eye, cover up your right eye, focus on the dot, and draw it in and see the square. Anybody seeing the dot disappear? Anybody seeing the dot disappear? Okay, this is what I want you to do. When you see that dot disappear, I want you to stop it right there. Let it disappear for you. And then go back and look at the dot. Is it back? Just move your eye over the dot. It shows right back up. Go back to the cross. The dot disappears, right? So yeah, right. Everybody's like, I got to get my readers. Okay, so here's the other thing that I want to ask. Those of you, if it didn't work for you, go ahead and take this home and play with it later because you'll see it. Everybody has this blind spot in one of your eyes, okay? I want to ask you this. For those of you for whom the circle disappeared, what took its place? When it went away, what happened to the spot where it once was? It turned yellow, didn't it? It didn't just become a blank spot, did it? So suddenly what is there is not there, and what is not there is there. There's no yellow there. But when you get in that blind spot, that yellow shows up. That's because the mind just cannot stand having a gap in its information. It will actually fill in the gap and make you not see something that's there and make you see something that's not there. There's actually a name for this. The name of it is unconscious inference. An unconscious inference is the involuntary, pre-rational, and reflex-like mechanism which is part of the formation of visual impressions. This is biological. No matter how hard you look at these tables, you're not going to be able to see them as the same because they're two-dimensional objects that your body and your mind is trying to turn into a three-dimensional object, and the way they're laid out, unconscious inference will not let you see them for what they really are. Unconscious inference is going to make sure that you see yellow where that dot disappears. It's something that you can't control. It's involuntary. It's pre-rational. It's a reflex. And it just happens whether you want it to happen or not. So what does this have to do with a conversation about race and about bias? Well, there's actually some really important work being done right now by some people who are asking this question. Is unconscious inference and the reality of it and what happens during it, is that something that can give us insight into how we perceive other people? So when we see other people and we encounter them for the first time, are we sure we're seeing what's there? Or are we sure that we're seeing what's not there? What's going on for our brain when we take in the information that we see in another person or group of people? What's happening? See, what often happens is when we encounter someone who's different from us, maybe they have a different skin color, or they're wearing different clothes that we would normally wear, or they've got some kind of article of clothing on or a symbol that indicates a religion that's different than ours. Maybe we hear them speak, and they speak with an accent, or they speak a language that's different from ours. When we encounter that, our brains are working really hard to figure out who they are. But because we don't know much about them, because they're strangers and because they come from a world and a culture and a skin color that's very different from ours, a world experience that's very different from ours, the brain kind of fills in gaps. The brain wants to answer what it doesn't know. And because of that, it creates something called implicit bias. And implicit bias is an unconscious preference or aversion, it's preference or aversion to a person or group of people based on associated stereotypes or assumptions. It's reflexive. It's pre-conscious. It's not rational. An implicit bias is something that lives in us that causes us to see something that may not be there or not see something that is there. And because of that, when we encounter someone who is different from us, that isn't like us, we're liable to fill in gaps. And that's not always a good thing, right? So why is it that we do this? Why is it that we're, even though we know you can't categorize whole groups of people by what we see in them. We know we can't do that rationally, but we can't help ourselves. Sometimes we see someone and just a bias jumps up within us. Why is it that we do that? First thing that I want to say is what I said when we started this morning. When that happens to us, this does not mean that we are racist people. Okay, we've got to let that go. Because if we can't let that go, then we'll never give ourselves the grace that we need to move beyond it. It's an implicit bias. It's what's going on in us. And we've all got them. It doesn't mean we're racist people. We're good people, right? We've just got something going on in us that we need to address. There's many reasons why this happens, but one of the reasons that some people believe it happens is biological. That it goes back to our earliest ancestors and back to a time and place when merely staying alive was hard. Getting through the day was challenging. And what was happening for our ancestors in that very threatening environment was that they were figuring out survival skills, and at the top of those survival skills were taking all of the visual and auditory inputs that were happening around them and categorizing them very quickly. And the reason that they had to do it very quickly was because they needed to determine immediately whether something was safe or something was a threat. Because if something was a threat and could challenge their life or the life of their tribe, the people that they love and the people that they're responsible for protecting, then they knew they had to jump to action. And what often happened is that if there were things that they recognized, things that they were familiar with, they responded much more slowly. But if it was something that was unfamiliar, an animal, a sound, a circumstance, a situation, another human, that they didn't know or recognize, their first thought was one of protection, because they couldn't determine whether this was safe or whether this was dangerous. And so if they didn't understand it, they just put it in a big box. And that box said, might kill you, right? Let me give you an example of how this worked once in my life. This isn't race related, but it gives you an example of what I'm talking about. I do not study snakes. I don't have a phobia of snakes. I just don't study snakes. And because I don't study snakes, when I see a snake, I can't tell immediately whether that snake is a harmless snake or whether that snake is a venomous snake. Is that snake passive or is that snake aggressive? Because I can't differentiate between those things, and I know that there are markings and all that kind of stuff, I know that. But when I see snake, I put snake in big box, and on the outside of the big box it says might kill you, right? So I was cleaning my basement one afternoon, and I reached down and I picked up a pile of Christmas lights. And what do you think was coiled up underneath the Christmas lights? It might kill you. That's what was coiled up underneath the Christmas lights. And so my brain sent a signal to my legs. Right? You know the signal. You might have gotten it before. And it was kind of a jump run kind of thing. I may or may not have screamed, but I'm also pretty sure I threw the lights back on top of the snake. I mean, this was like multitasking at its finest, right? Because as soon as I saw that snake, I didn't know what it was. And so I put it in the big box with all the other snakes, and on the outside of that box it said, might kill you. So from a distance, I re-examined the snake, with a stick, picking up the Christmas lights, looking at the snake, figuring out what it is, and I realized it was just a garden snake. Now, granted, it might have been one of those deadly garden snakes. I don't know. I took great caution at getting it in a bucket and getting it outside, right? If I was a herpetologist, if I studied snakes, if I studied reptiles, if I really got into it, the moment I saw that snake, I would have known very quickly. I would have been able not just to put it in a big box that says might kill you, I would have put it in a snake box, and inside the snake box there would have been poisonous snakes and non-poisonous snakes, aggressive snakes and non-aggressive snakes. There would have been all kinds of little categories of boxes that I very quickly could have put that snake in because I would have known it, had relationship with it, and understood it. My first instinct wouldn't have necessarily been it's going to kill me. It would have been, oh, it's just a garden snake, you're fine. I might have reached down and picked it up and taken it outside. But I don't study snakes. And so for me, the best course of action is just assume they're all going to kill me. That's okay when it comes to snakes. Maybe. Not okay when it comes to people. This is what happens, I think, when it comes to people, is that we tend to spend most of our life with people who look like us, talk like us, dress like us, believe like us, and in Kentucky, drink like us. Okay? We tend to spend most of our time with people who are similar to us. And because of that, when we see people who are similar to us, it's very easy for us to see each of those similarly dressed, similarly colored, similarly believing, similar type people. And when we put them in a box, we don't just put them in a big box that says white European. We put them in boxes that are broken down. They're separated. We can put them in all kinds of different categories because we know there's all kinds of differences between us. But the problem is that because we spend so much time with people who are like us, we don't spend a lot of time, most of us, with people who are different. Now, I know that everyone in this room has friends and maybe relatives who are of a different racial and ethnic heritage, who have different beliefs in terms of their religion, who come from different places around the world. I know we all have relationships with people who are different. But most of us, that comprises a minority of the relationships that we have. And it's not that those things aren't good, but this is what can happen. If we only have a few relationships with people of one category of person, race, ethnicity, religion, or whatever, we can begin to believe that that person is an exception to the overall rule that we've created for the whole body of people. That this person is somehow different than all the other people. Like here's a way that I've experienced this before. I've talked with many people about some of my concerns and fears of raising an African American teenager and what that means for my son. I've had multiple people with all of the very best of intentions say to me, that won't happen to Ethan. And when I say, why do you say that? They say, because he's different. Now, when I hear someone say that, I know where they're coming from and what they're trying to say, but as soon as they say it, I have a question that I'm dying to ask back. Different from what? Different from whom? Because you see, in telling me that my African American son that you happen to know, that you happen to love, that you can tell me what his interests and likes and dislikes are, you've been raising him since he was 2 years old. You know him. What you're telling me when you say he's different is you're telling me that he's different from all those stereotypes you have from other African American men. The dangers they face won't confront Ethan because he's different. Why is he different? Because you know him. That's why he's different. Because you have a relationship with him, because you know the fullness of who he is and what he is, and you can see the difference in him. Now, what ideally would happen is that we wouldn't just have one friend of a different race or ethnicity or religion or background or nationality or whatever, that we wouldn't just have 10, that we would have enough so that we would get to understand in our minds the same thing we understand when we see a room full of people who look like us. That we are every bit as different and every bit as alike as we could ever be. There's no way to define everyone in the same way. And when we do that, this implicit bias, when we start to do those things, it creates that stereotyping that we've already talked about a little bit. Now, I'm going to name some ethnic groups and some national groups, and as I do so, I want you to think about a racial stereotype or a stereotype that you've heard about them. I do not want you to say that out loud. Okay? I just want you to think of a descriptor you may have heard that has been used to describe these people. Okay? Mexican, African American, Asian, Middle Eastern male. My guess is you were probably able pretty quickly to come up with one, if not multiple, ways that you've heard people describe those entire groups of people. Now, if I were to ask you to name a stereotype that you would see as being more true than not true of all white people, I'm talking to you white folk right now, what would it be? Don't say it out loud, but what would it be? Now, part of us, when we hear that, is we kind of go, well, there really is no stereotype that describes every person of a white color. But what about this? What if I say, I want you to give me a stereotype of an Italian American? Does that give you something to work with? How about Irish American? How about Swedish American? How about Yankee? How about Southerner? Does that give you something to work with? You see, what happens is when we start to break down from the whole group, we start to think about ways we can maybe stereotype and pinpoint different subgroups underneath them. But that's because stereotypes tend to come out of a dominant culture. And out of a dominant culture, we put stereotypes we paint with stereotypes over the broad brush of a non-dominant culture. Guess what? If you went to Asia, they would not have the same stereotypes about Asians that we do. Do you think if you went to Mexico, they would have the same stereotypes that we think of with Mexicans in Mexico? By the way, they're pretty much all Mexicans, right? If you went to the Middle East, do you think that they would look at all Middle Eastern males in the same way that we often look at them? If you went to a country that was predominantly filled with people who had black skin, do you think that they would look at young black males and assume they had a higher propensity for criminality? No, you wouldn't. Because racial stereotypes come out of dominant culture. But if you went to Mexico or Asia or the Middle East or Africa or even Europe, and you ask them if they had stereotypes about white Americans, you better sit down. Because guess what? They've got them. They're not kind in a lot of ways. And I'll tell you right now, they're not true of every one of us. And if you heard them, you'd think, that's not true of me. That's not true of my loved ones. That's not true of the people who call my country their home. And you would think those stereotypes are ridiculous. But still, when it comes to people who are different from us, our bias just gets the best of us. And because we don't have relationships with them, we just put them in a box. And the boxes often begin with a label. Mexican, African American, European, Middle Eastern. Whatever the case may be, we just put them in that box very quickly. And if we don't know enough about them, we're going to go ahead and label that box as this might kill me. This might threaten me. That's implicit bias. That's what happens when implicit bias can get the best of us. There's a great story in Scripture about implicit bias. I bet you've heard it. It's a story about a man who was beaten and left for dead by the side of the road. As he was there dying, two people passed him, a priest and a Levite. Priest and a Levite had the stereotypical reputation of being the finest people in all of Judaism. They were all good. But guess what the priest and Levite did? You know the story, right? They walked right on by. And then a Samaritan came along. And you know the story of Samaritans. The Jewish people hated the Samaritans. I mean, they hated them. And yet the Samaritan comes and the Samaritan takes care of the guy and saves his life. Now, we've turned this into kind of a feel-good parable about how we are called to take care of those who are hurt, right? And we teach it to our children, and our youth groups act it out in all kinds of different ways, and we do all this stuff, and we've turned it into a feel-good kind of favorite story for us. But when this story was first told, it was one of the most offensive stories that Jesus ever uttered. And it was one of the most offensive stories that was told in the early community of faith. Why was it so offensive? Because the good guys, the priest and Levite, were turned into bad guys. And the bad guy was turned into the hero. They hated this story because it pressed them. Because everything they knew about Samaritans was they might kill me, and they are all bad. What I think is so powerful about this story is how we get to the story's telling in the first place. A man comes to Jesus and says, "What must I do to get to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, hey, what does the law tell you?" And the guy says, "Well, the law says that I have to love the Lord my God with all my heart, with all my mind, with all my strength, and with all my soul, and I have to love my neighbor as myself." And Jesus says, "Bingo, you got it." And then Scripture tells us that the man, wanting to justify himself. Curious, right? What does he need to justify? Justifying means that there's something that he's not following in the law, that he wants an excuse, he wants a pass, he wants to get out of it. He wants to justify his actions that don't live into the law. Now, at this point, we're not sure, is he not living into the love your God part or the love your neighbor part? But one of them he's not living into, and he's wanting to pass. He's wanting some justification. And so, wanting to justify himself, he looks at Jesus and he says, "Okay, who's my neighbor?" Now, as soon as he asks the question, we know what he's trying to justify. He is not living into the commandment to love his neighbor. And Jesus, seeing into his heart the way Jesus sees into all of our hearts, knows that specifically this man is not loving towards Samaritans, and he's done some things that are outside of the law. The man wants justification. Jesus wants him to accept that he's got something broken within him. And in one story, Jesus turns the whole narrative around and points to everyone who was listening. Look, priests and Levites aren't all good. But just because there's a couple of bad priests and Levites doesn't mean that all priests and Levites are bad. And then Jesus points out that obviously not all Samaritans are bad. And if there's one good Samaritan, maybe there's two. And if there's two, maybe there's 10. And if there's 10, you see where this is going, right? The Israelites, the Jewish people, knew in their heads, they knew up here that there was no way all Samaritans were bad. But they just put them in a box, they labeled that box, and they closed the lid and they quit thinking about it. Because that's what their society told them was okay. Jesus says that's not good enough. Can't do that. And we can't do that either. In that story, Jesus gives us an example of how we stop the cycle of bias. And what he does for the man in the story is the first thing he does is he helps the man detect the bias. He names it. The second thing Jesus does is he rejects it. And he calls him out on it and says, your biases, your stereotypes are not accurate. They need to be rejected. And the third thing Jesus does for him is he teaches him how to replace it. I'm going to tell you a story that I've told before. But it's a story where I experienced this very thing. And I'm probably not alone in this. Again, as we've already talked about, and as you know, I have an African-American teenage son. One afternoon, I was downtown visiting someone at the hospital. I came out of the hospital. My truck was parked on the road because my truck is so awesomely big, I'm afraid to park it in garages. So I parked it on the road. And I came out, and as I was getting ready to cross the street to go and get into my truck, there was a group of African-American teenagers standing right by the driver's side door. And the first thought that came to my mind was danger. I felt threatened. Now, I've told this story before. In response to it, people have said, what you were feeling wasn't about race. You probably would have been intimidated if it was a group of white teenagers. Nay. I've walked through groups of white teenagers my whole life. I can't even remember ever doing it. I mean, it didn't stick with me. I know what was happening in that moment, and what was happening in that moment was I saw a group of African-American teenagers at the door of my truck that I had to get through in order to get in, and I felt threatened. The moment I felt threatened, I also felt like a real jerk. Because that was my son. It wasn't my actual son. It was somebody else's son. But my son looked just like him. For crying out loud, I have an African-American son who is a teenager, and I walk outside and see a group of African-American teenagers, and the implicit bias that was in me caused me to feel threatened. I detected it. This is what's going on. It's not good. I rejected it. Said, dude, you're being a jerk. You know this isn't true. You know this is more about you than it is about them. And then I replaced it by crossing the street, introducing myself, and talking to the people who were standing next to my truck. And guess what? Oh my God, they were great people. They were wonderful. They were students. They were there. They were fine. Right? Friends, there are going to be moments in your life where you walk up into a situation or you walk up to a person and something's just going to surface within you. It's unconscious, it's reflexive, you may not even know it's there, it's going to surface, and you're going to think something about that person, and you're going to assume something about that person because your mind can't handle the gap of not knowing, and if you don't know enough about that person, that instinctual part of you is going to say, this might kill me. This might hurt me. Now look, I know that there are threats out there, and I know sometimes there are situations and there are people that are threatening and they are dangerous. But I'm here to tell you that one of the most threatening and dangerous things that exists in our society today is viewing entire bodies of people because of their color, their faith, their nationality, their religion, or whatever it may be, seeing entire bodies of people as threatening to our safety. That is dangerous. And it leads to what we saw in Charlottesville yesterday. It leads to people dying. And it's not good. First thing we do when we feel that stuff surface within us is we've got to detect it. We've just got to say, there it is. And then we got to reject it. And say, no, this person is a whole person. This person is no, I got to reject this. I got to move past it. And then you've got to replace it. And the way that you replace it is relationship. Contact, communication, getting to know other people, who they are and what they believe and how they worship and all the dreams and all the worries and all the fears that they have. You've got to get to know them because relationship is the only thing that helps us to see the reality that we already see in our dominant culture, that there is no way to define all of us in any one single way. Maybe, just maybe, if our eyes look at those tables, and no matter what we tell ourselves, they look different, but we know now without a shadow of a doubt that they're the same size, don't we? Maybe, just maybe, what's true at those tables is true with the differences between us. That no matter how different we may look, we're far more alike than we are not. Friends, maybe, just maybe, when it comes to race and prejudice and bias, we've all got some blind spots within us. And we see things that aren't there, and we don't see things that are. This is my hope for us as we continue to work through this, that the first box we put everyone in is the box that says created in God's image. The box that says this is God's son and this is God's daughter. My prayer for us is that when we begin to feel those moments of bias, we'll just remember that red and yellow, black and white, they are all precious in God's sight. And that maybe, just maybe, in so doing, we'll discover just who our neighbor is and what it means to love them. Amen.